do you feel the events of September the 11th changed the way news was covered in America?
It had a complicated effect in the United States, which of course reflects itself somewhat in the media. But among the general population, which is, I think, the most interesting, it first of all inspired fear, which was quite appropriate. I mean, my own feeling is it's likely to be the first of a series of terrorist attacks. That was enhanced by the Anthrax scare right afterwards. It was not entirely new. I mean, it was known long before that there could be such an attack. In fact, there was an attempt to blow up the World Trade Center in 1993, which came pretty close to success. And there were technical studies on it and so on, but it just wasn't part of the popular consciousness. So this clearly did that. Fear, jingoism, lots of flags and so on. On the other hand, it had another effect. It opened people's minds. The United States is an extremely insular society. People don't pay much attention to the outside world. A lot of people couldn't tell you where France is. It's big country, rich country. People are inwardly oriented. This made a lot of people think we better learn something about the world. There's some reason for what are we doing, what's going on in the world. And that had a very positive impact. It was very visible to people like me, who, those of us who spend a lot of time traveling and speaking and so on. I mean, invitations just shot up. Audiences are much larger, much more engaged, much more interested. The small book publishers publish, left publishers, which have a pretty small outreach. All of a sudden they had to start republishing their books from the 70s and the 80s because there was so much demand for them. And it just opened the country up a lot to debate and discussion. To some extent that reflected itself in the media. Not much, but they're more conformist, but they reflect to some extent changes happening in the country.
The anti-war movement always has been one that's sort of associated in the 60s and the 70s particularly. Do you feel that has changed, strengthened since 9/11?
Well, first of all, it had continued to strengthen since the 1960s. And contrary to what many people believe, it's much higher now than it was in the 60s. In order to have a reasonable comparison, you have to compare the Iraq War to the Vietnam War. Now, an anti-war movement in the United States did not develop on a large scale in the United States until there were close to 500,000 troops in South Vietnam. South Vietnam was practically destroyed. The war had extended to the north, which was costly to the United States, so therefore was done very carefully. Meanwhile, South Vietnam was just being devastated without cost. For years, there was no anti-war movement. The Iraq War has never reached the level of at which an anti-war movement developed in the 60s. At the time when, say, there were 150,000 American troops in South Vietnam, there was a very small anti-war movement. In fact, just to give you an illustration, the war, it was so small that people are not even aware of when the war began. I mean, the war actually began in 1962. There was plenty of terror and violence before, but the actual U.S. invasion was in 1962. That's when Kennedy sent the U.S. Air Force to start bombing South Vietnam. They authorized chemical warfare to destroy crops and ground cover, authorized napalm, started driving people into what were called strategic hamlets, basically concentration camps, urban slums, ultimately millions of people. I mean, that's aggression. But there was no reaction at all. And for several years, you want to talk about Vietnam, you talk to people in their living rooms, church with 4 people. Right here in the universities, Cambridge. If we wanted to have a few of us who were interested, if we wanted to have a meeting on Vietnam, we'd have to bring in half a dozen other topics. Venezuela, Middle East, a bunch of other things, Vietnam, then maybe some people would show up. The first attempt in Boston, which is a pretty liberal city, to have a public anti-war demonstration, like meeting at the Boston Common, essentially Hyde Park, where the public demonstrations are. It was actually in October 1965. At that point, there were, I think, about 250, 300,000 U.S. troops in South Vietnam. The bombing of the North had started. We did have a demonstration, or tried to, but it was broken up. I was supposed to be one of the speakers. We couldn't talk. It was broken up by, it would have been serious violence if there hadn't been a lot of state police around. A lot of them students. The Boston Globe, liberal newspaper, the next day had front page stories about it, denouncing the demonstrators and praising the disruption. That's a stage which the Iraq War has not come close to yet. And it was a year or two after that, finally the anti-war movement started. But even when the anti-war movement developed, if you look, it was mostly focused on the bombing of the North, which was bad enough, but it was a kind of a sideshow. I mean, the main attack, like about triple the bombing, was against South Vietnam. And that was never much of a topic of protest because the protest was focused on cost to us. In elite circles, there was almost no protest against the war at any time. Actually, an interesting comparison is somebody like, say, Arthur Schlesinger, died recently, the leading American liberal historian. In the early 1960s, he was an advisor to Kennedy. He supported the war. In fact, if you look at his book, 1,000 Days, Kennedy administration is virtually nothing about Vietnam. It's just routine. By the mid-late 60s, maybe 1966, he was becoming disillusioned with the war. So his position, I can quote it, was that we all pray that the Hawks will be right in thinking that more troops will bring victory. And if they are, we'll be praising the wisdom and statesmanship of the American government in turning Vietnam into a land of wreck and ruin, those are his words, but we'll have won. That's very much like elite criticism of the Iraq War today, almost the same words. When the invasion of Iraq took place, he was maybe unique in taking a radically different position. The day of the bombing, he had an article in a major newspaper in the United States in which he condemned it as analogous to Pearl Harbor. He said it's a date which will live in infamy as the United States follows the policies of Imperial Japan. Well, that was unusual. Very few people took that position, but the transition in his stand in the 60s and in this war, I think, is illustrative of a much greater opposition to aggression in the general population. So I don't think opposition to the war is anything like what it ought to be, but if you compare it to the 60s, it's greater. Actually, the Iraq War is the first war, I think, in Western history, hundreds of years, where there's been massive protest against an invasion before it was officially launched.
I can look at the role of the internet in that, but I'm just curious. You're here presumably in 1962. You are aware of what's going on in Vietnam, maybe not as focally as you would be today with access to the kind of media response. What was your day-to-day life like being aware of that? Were you angry about it? Were you aware of the volume of the acts and what was going on?
Yeah, I was pretty well aware of it, even without an internet, and was spending an awful lot of time on it. But it literally was what I described. Talk in some neighbor's living room, talk in a church to a couple of people, tents. By 1965, you were able to have teach-ins to a fair number of people. But by 1965, I was organizing resistance, with a few friends, organizing national tax resistance. A few years later, involved in organizing draft resistance, in and out of jail, constant demonstrations. It was taking up a big piece of life, very involved. Yeah, I didn't realize in detail what was happening, but you could find out. I mean, it wasn't impossible to find out. In fact, you could even find out from the most respected sources. So Bernard Fall, for example, who was, military historian, Vietnam specialist, the civilian who was most respected by the Pentagon, for example, in McNamara's memoirs, is the one person mentioned. He was telling the truth about it. Nobody was paying much attention, but he was describing accurately what was happening with real bitterness and anger. He was kind of a hawk. Like, he thought that Saigon government should really control all of Vietnam, but he cared about the country, and he saw that it was being wiped out. In fact, by 1967, when he was killed in combat, he was writing that he said, Vietnam as a cultural and historical entity may not survive the most vicious assault that any country has ever, this size has ever endured from major military power. That was 67, when there was very little elite protest against the war. In fact, there never really was. The standard view was pretty much what I quoted from Schlesinger, and what the view is today among elites. We have to win, but if it costs us too much, maybe we should withdraw.
45 years on now. There is a perception in the UK about the reporting of the war in the US that the Americans are slow to move towards anti-war perception because of the way the war is reported. And I may seem naive to you, but would you say that's fairly standard, that's what it is?
Well, there are few reporters in England who are unusual. Robert Fisk, Patrick Cockburn, a couple others, they really report the war. There's nobody comparable to that here. On the other hand, reporting is courageous, honorable, and I think generally accurate. But we have to remember that the Iraq War is maybe unique in history in that it can't be covered directly. The catastrophe that the United States and Britain have created is so extraordinary that reporters simply can't cover it. There's not, I mean, there are a few who do, like, say, Patrick Cockburn, but not many. It's just too dangerous. I mean, the reporters are pretty much confined to either the Green Zone, which is like a fortified fortress in the middle of Baghdad, a couple of places where they're under protection or embedded with troops, and it's not lack of courage. It's just, you just can't do it. It's too dangerous. I mean, that was not true in Vietnam. It's not true in the Russian invasion of Afghanistan. In fact, I can't think of a case where it was true. So the limitation, and they rely very much on Iraqi stringers, for whom it's extremely dangerous, and they're just abandoned, murdered. Nobody protects them. There's nothing for them. So of course there are limits in that respect.
Would it be cynical to say that suits the aggressors?
Sure. I mean, they tried to make sure that reporters were embedded in combat units, and there were some who refused, and usually the networks and media just wouldn't carry their material. But sometimes the war is, in my view, the worst part of the coverage is where it's accurate. So, for example, was it November 2004, I guess, the attack on Fallujah, which was a major war crime, was accurately reported, but reported as if it was just fine. So the first day of the invasion of Fallujah, the U.S. forces, if you look at the front page of the New York Times, you see it in my mind's eye. There was a picture of the hospital in Fallujah with the patients lying on the floor, their hands tied behind their backs, doctors lying on the floor, and an American soldier guarding them. And there was a story accompanying it. The first act of the American forces when they went into Fallujah was to take over the general hospital and toss the patients out of bed on the floor, manacle them, and so on. And they had a reason. They said it's a propaganda center. It's reporting, it's inflating war casualties. I mean, this is a grave breach of the Geneva Conventions. I mean, even under American law, President Bush should be executed for that. The War Crimes Act of 1996 makes it a crime for which you can be sentenced to death for grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions. What's that? Geneva Conventions are quite explicit on protecting hospitals and medical facilities. Well, it's sitting right in the front page of the New York Times, a story praising it. And it went on like that. I mean, you know, they were talking about how the soldiers were disappointed because they couldn't find the you know, the ants in their ant hills, or whatever the phrase was, you know, the rodents in their warrens or something. There's a dead girl lying on the ground, but they weren't sure whether she was an insurgent or not. You know, that, I mean, it was just grotesque. It was accurate reporting and completely grotesque. That's the worst part.
So it's like the writing itself, the actual coverage, the media, it seems to have a moral responsibility cauterized from its...
So that's not just... So I think it's a little unfair to criticize the media. That is the intellectual climate in Britain as well, in Europe as well. I mean, just take a current example. When George Bush announced the surge, you know, the increase in troops, first of all, it was in direct violation of the will of the American people, and of course, the overwhelming opposition of Iraqis, but they're irrelevant. But it was predictable that the surge would be accompanied by propaganda about Iranian intervention in Iraq, sort of to justify, you know, we have to defend ourselves. And that happened. So immediately you started getting reports about you know, roadside bombs, IEDs with serial markings from Iran and so on. And then comes a debate. The debate is over whether the serial markings are really from Iran. I mean, is intelligence really telling the truth? Does it go to the, is it just the Revolutionary Guards, or is it the higher echelons? So that's the debate in England too. I mean, you don't know whether to laugh or cry. How can Iran be intervening in Iraq? It's like asking whether the Allies were intervening in sovereign France in 1943. You can only have this discussion on the assumption that the United States owns the world. So if we invade and occupy another country, and somebody, say, is involved in resistance to the occupation, they're the aggressors. Now that's the way a sophisticated propaganda system works. I mean, in a totalitarian state, you declare the party line officially, and everyone has to obey it, or else. You know, in a free country, you don't do that. What you do is presuppose the party line. You never articulate it. You just presuppose it. Then you encourage vigorous debate as long as it stays within the bounds of the party line. Here's a prototypical example. The party line is, we own the world. Therefore, if anybody interferes with what we're doing, they're the criminals. Nobody says that. It's just presupposed. That's the assumption on which discussion proceeds. Then you have a vigorous debate. You know, are the Iranians really doing it? Aren't they doing it? And so on. Well, you know, it's not just the media. You can't blame the media for that. That's the intellectual atmosphere. It's the intellectual culture. There's a just deeply rooted imperial culture which takes things like this for granted. And yes, of course, the media reflect it too, but it's a much deeper pathology than that.
Well, I wonder which of the two questions is harder. How did we get here, or how do we get out of it?
Well, first of all, we've always been there, so there's nothing about how we got here. So let's go back to Vietnam again. In the case of Vietnam, same questions were raised. Are the Russians and the Chinese intervening? So like if the Russians were providing anti-aircraft batteries to protect North Vietnam, not South Vietnam, that's free game, you do whatever you like, to protect, say, Hanoi from U.S. bombing, they're intervening. If the Chinese were sending in construction crews to rebuild the Chinese railroad that the United States was bombing in North Vietnam, then 50,000 Chinese, they're invading North Vietnam. It's the same discussion. It's the same in Central America. I mean, if say, take the U.S. terrorist war against Nicaragua in the 1980s, the question is whether the Russians are carrying out aggression in this hemisphere. The U.S., as usual, tried to get Nicaragua to rely on Russian arms, just as they did with Guatemala and Cuba. And what you do is threaten a country with attack or actually attack it, cut off arms supplies from your allies. You tell them you're not allowed to send arms, and then you hope maybe they'll turn to the Russians, so then you have a justification for the attack. They tried that with Nicaragua. Nicaragua was smart enough not to accept arms from, say, MiGs and so on. So there were MiG scares constantly raised. Like the U.S. desperately wanted to prevent the 1984 election, and it was kind of wiped out of history because they knew the wrong people were going to win. Free election, carefully monitored, but wrong outcome, so it didn't happen. One of the ways of eliminating the election, and of course the media went along, was to run a MiG scare at the time, as it was called. Say, well, you know, U.S. intelligence found crates in the harbor which contained MiGs and so on. Then comes a debate, as usual, vigorous debate. The Hawks say, we got to bomb them. The Russians are attacking us. The Doves said, it could not, maybe it's not true. Maybe it's the intelligence isn't good enough. But if they are sending MiGs, yeah, then we have to bomb them. That was the Doves. Well, why would they be getting MiGs? Well, because the U.S. was controlling Nicaraguan airspace and was using that to be, so that the CIA could send instructions to terrorist forces to avoid the Nicaraguan army and attack what were called soft targets, undefended civilian targets. All right, that's legitimate. And if Nicaragua tries to protect its airspace, that's criminal. And if the Russians are involved, it's aggression. And the Doves say, well, if that's what's really happening, yeah, we have to bomb Nicaragua. And you want to go back further? We can go back to the Declaration of Independence. Declaration of Independence, one of the charges against King George is that he caused the merciless Indian savages to attack us with their known ways of warfare, you know, sort of barbarism and so on and so forth. You know, like all propaganda, there's an element of truth, but Thomas Jefferson knew perfectly well it was the merciless European English colonists who were, with their known way of warfare, were carrying out barbaric acts. But we had to protect ourselves from the merciless Indian savages and King George. And so on through history, and the British history is the same, and so is everyone else's. So I don't think there's any question how we got into it. As to how you get out of it, actually we have to some extent gotten out of it. As the population becomes more civilized, as it sort of does over time. That's why there's more opposition to the war now than in the 60s. The media and the intellectual culture shift to some extent, rarely as far as the population. In fact, Vietnam is a striking case of that. In 1969, when the business world had turned against the war, and the intellectual world was turning against the war, and the population was, there was a difference. In the intellectual world and the media, about the most critical voice you could find was someone like, say, Anthony Lewis in the New York Times, who said the war began with benign intentions, benevolent efforts to do good and so on, but by 1969 it had become a disaster, too costly for us. That was criticism at the left of the intellectual spectrum. Same year, 1969, 70% of the American population said the war was fundamentally wrong and immoral, not a mistake. And those figures stayed pretty steady right to into the new millennium. You barely find a sentence like that in journals or media or academic scholarship and so on. Now, exactly what people meant by that is not absolutely certain, because the people who take the polls never ask the next question. You know, what do you mean by that? They don't want to hear the answer. But it's possible that it meant just what it sounds like. And I think that's not unusual.
What was the impact in America, as you saw it, of the Vietnamese the Vietnamese monks self-immolating themselves in the 60s? It was visually seen by people in the United States.
It did bring to people a sense of the intensity of the struggle. It never overcame the basic propaganda image. I mean, the basic propaganda image is the United States is defending the South Vietnamese against communist terrorists run by the North, ultimately by the Russians or the Chinese or someone. That was the propaganda image that was instilled. At the most, you could maybe say it's a civil war in South Vietnam. Nobody practically, except way at the extreme, could say what the truth was. It was a U.S. invasion of South Vietnam, an invasion against, which was, we now know from internal documents and province advisory reports and so on, that the government knew perfectly well that they were fighting indigenous forces with overwhelming popular support. Actually, that became dramatically obvious, and there was a huge effort to conceal it at the time of the Tet Offensive. I don't think there's been anything like that in history. The Tet Offensive, the country had over 500,000 U.S. troops. I think maybe at the time 50,000 or more mercenaries, maybe 100,000 mercenaries from other countries. Client army, huge army. The country was totally saturated with informers, with troops, and so on. And then, unexpectedly, the whole country arose in rebellion. Everywhere. Certainly everyone knew about it. They kept it secret. The U.S. completely taken aback. The massive firepower was brought in to try to suppress it. A ton of destruction. That's when you get, you have to destroy the village to save it, and so on. They almost took over the embassy. I don't think there's been an event. I don't know of an event like that. An illustration of the depth of opposition to foreign invasion. It certainly wasn't true of occupied Europe under the Nazis. Nothing like that could happen. There's too much support for the occupation. But they sort of knew it from the beginning. The extent was overwhelming, but it never really reached the public. In fact, the Tet Offensive was described as a defeat for the North Vietnamese. Actually, there were North Vietnamese. They were on the border. They're trying to draw U.S. troops away from the center of the country toward the border. There were fewer, according to the Pentagon, there were fewer North Vietnamese in South Vietnam at the time than there were South Korean mercenaries, let alone U.S. troops. But that was not the picture. The picture is we're defending ourselves, we're defending the South Vietnamese from North Vietnamese aggression. And even the acts like what you described were described as kind of aberrations, shows their primitive mentality or something like that. Actually, we see something quite similar today. I hear people in Congress talking about the primitive brutality of the Iraqis who murder each other. What can we do with people like these who are just barbarians?
How do those same people answer acts like Norman Morrison's act at the Pentagon in 65? That's difficult. They can't use the same arguments there, can they, as savages?
Well, they can say strange, pacifist aberration. There's always strange people around the periphery. In fact, they treated the resistors the same way. Actually, I was closely involved with the resistance, so I knew the young people. It's presented now as if they were trying to evade the draft. It was presented the same way then. That's what's called the Vietnam syndrome. The U.S. didn't want people to be drafted, and it's totally false. The resistance was led by theology students. They'd never be drafted. Most privileged young men, if they wanted to get out of the draft, it wasn't very hard. You're a Harvard student, you go to the clinic psychologist and get him to say you're a homosexual or anything. There were all kind of ways of getting out if you wanted to. But these were young kids who purposely put themselves on the line, in danger. You're an 18-year-old kid. It's not fun to face the idea of 5 years in prison or permanent exile. That's serious. And they were courageous and honorable. Well, that can't be accepted. That's unacceptable. They had to be cowards trying to evade the draft. Well, there were people who just tried to evade the draft, like George Bush and others. But the resistance was not that way. These were courageous young people who incidentally had a big effect on their own families and parents sometimes, interesting ways. But that's not the way it was presented. Cowards, draft dodgers, trying to save themselves, privileged kids trying to make sure that the poor are on the front lines and so on. And the same with Norman Morrison. Or else they're anti-American, It was like it's not just the war, it's anything else. The 60s were the beginnings, the bare beginnings of the feminist movement, which has probably changed the society and civilized it more than any other of the past 40 years. It had enormous effects everywhere. They were bra burners, crazed women, men haters. Yeah, that's the way privileged, powerful groups respond to any challenge to their authority.
I think against that backdrop, the guy we're talking about, we're doing the program about Malachi, Ritscher, on the 3rd of November, he wrapped himself in an American flag and self-immolated himself on the expressway in Chicago on that particular morning. And it was an act of self-immolation, as he said on his own website, in protest at the Iraqi invasion, the continued occupation. Do you support that act in any way?
I support his courage. Incidentally, if you did a poll of the United States, maybe 1 in a million people ever heard of it. You might try it, or even look it up on the internet and see what the coverage is. Almost nobody knows about it. And to the extent that it's known at all, it's the act of some crazy person. Do I support it? I don't like to see people kill themselves. I think they're more, for all kind of reasons, moral reasons, and even tactical reasons. I think they're better means of protest.
This was a man who had got to that point where he felt this was the only statement he could make.
It's understandable. I also understood in the late 1960s why MIT students, say, other teenage kids who I knew, were joining the Weathermen. I thought they were making a bad mistake, but you could certainly understand them. You could understand the passion and the emotion and the integrity that was behind it. Bad mistake, I think. Tried to talk them out of it, but understandable.
It was quite interesting on that morning, and I completely agree with you about the 1 in a million. I'm probably less than that. We've already found, talking to people, they say, Malachi, who?
Yeah.
And for someone to give their life, I mean, obviously that must be the greatest thing you can give in terms of what you've got to offer personally. Initially, the helicopters were flying over, talking about the traffic coming in, and we've got a problem on freeway, whatever it is. I mean, that was the first reaction. And as they showed pictures, it became a story. And then you had this sense that they then realized who this guy was. And this is a guy who was arrested in 2003 and 2005 for the demonstrations in Chicago against the war. The story disappeared, completely disappeared. Does that surprise you, first of all?
No. If you check the Norman Morrison story, you'll find about the same. I mean, it is completely standard, and I do not particularly criticize the media specifically. They're reflecting the intellectual culture. In fact, in the 60s, it was much worse. Let me tell you a story that's worse, one of the worst I've ever seen. In maybe 1967 or so in Chicago, the Chicago Museum of Science, which is a famous, important institution, had a diorama of a Vietnamese village, which was set up so that children could stand around it with guns pointing at it and could shoot into the village, shoot the villagers, and and not destroy the huts and so on. A group of mothers protested. There was a silent protest of a group of mothers saying they didn't want their children to be shooting at Vietnamese villagers. There was a story about it in the New York Times, condemning the mothers because they were depriving the kiddies of a chance to have fun. I mean, I remember what I wrote at the time. It's one of the statements I've written which caused more fury than maybe anything I've ever said. I said, when you look at that New York Times story, you have to ask whether what the country needs is dissent or denazification. I mean, I'd repeat that now. I'm very happy to see the infuriated reaction. But what is the answer to the question when you see things like that? Okay. I've heard the denunciations. I've never heard the answer. And it's no different elsewhere. This happened to be an extreme case, but the hospital in Fallujah, What's the reaction? Actually, just to add something to that, the Bush administration was aware of the danger. Before that, Alberto Gonzales, now Attorney General, was the president's legal advisor. And a memorandum was leaked from 2002 in which he advised the president to effectively rescind the Geneva Conventions because that would reduce the likelihood of eventual prosecution. And if you look at the Military Commissions Act, one of the most disgraceful pieces of legislation ever passed in the United States, bipartisan, about a year ago, was supposed to be to reduce torture or something. Actually, if you look at it, one of the things it does is effectively rescind the War Crimes Act. It says that high officials can't be charged under the War Crimes Act, which, to repeat, were passed by a Republican Congress, which does provide for sentences up to the death sentence for grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions. They don't want any danger of that. Not that there is much.
One final question. I want to ask you if you feel optimistic about the internet and what it may offer, the chance for free speech, whatever that is, and the communication of an understanding on a more global level of what actually imperial powers are doing.
The internet is extremely important. Incidentally, it's an illustration of the way the economy works. Like most of the economy, the internet grew out of the state sector. These are not market societies. The state sector in the United States is the core of the dynamism of the economy. The entrepreneurial initiative comes largely from the state sector, research and development, and so on. Internet is an example. It's actually developed right here, which is Pentagon University. You know, it was in the state sector for about 30 years before it was handed over to private power, but like computers and other things. But it's been liberating in many ways. It's complex. There are many conflicting aspects to it. You can't categorize it easily. For people who are interested in learning about the world, it provides opportunities that never existed before. So you can read, say, Patrick Cockburn, Robert Fisk on Iraq. You can't do that here. And there's you can pick up Al Jazeera on the internet. You can find sources from all over, critical material and so on. It's a great technique for organizing. In fact, almost all activism now is internet organized.
The guy who committed suicide, he had his own site explaining why he did it.
That's right. And just, the major social movements now are, let's say, the World Social Forum, the global justice movements and so on. Almost anything comes through the internet. All of that is very positive. On the other hand, it's also it has negative aspects. It draws people towards delusion, immersion in fantasy, all sorts of things, and there are extensive efforts to support that. It also has the unfortunate effect of fortifying cult-like behavior. So, for example, suppose I had a website, which I don't, and I put up on it, say, I read that, in some source that I give, that George Bush poisoned the water in Omaha. Tomorrow somebody else would put something and say, yeah, it's not just Omaha. He did the same thing in South Dakota. Within a couple of days, you would have a cult saying George Bush is poisoning all the water in the world. And then it would become a real cult, like religious, immune, cocoon-like, immune to evidence, full of arcane demonstrations that, this in fact happened. Look at that coincidence and that one. How do you explain that? And so on. And pretty soon you get major cults, which are dangerous themselves and also draw people away from activism. And they're real ones. There's that danger. But, any means of communication that's developed is going to have potential downsides. And, of course, centralized power, state and corporate power, are going to control it for their interests.